Welcome to Cosmic Chosen. Oh, Chosen One, if only you could see what happens in the spirit when your name is spoken. They used to say it freely, mockingly even. In rooms full of doubt, they used your name like a punchline. Behind screens, they plotted. In whispers, they crafted betrayals, so precise they thought destiny could be rewritten with group chats and fake smiles. They believed your downfall was inevitable, but they never understood who you were. Now, your name chokes in their throat. Your presence? It rattles their nervous system, because every scheme they devised has boomeranged back onto them, not by your hand, but by divine design. They didn't just underestimate your resilience. They underestimated your anointing. You see, 80% of betrayal comes dressed in applause. It smiles when you walk in the room and stabs when your back is turned. But what about the other 20%? Those are the ones who knew exactly who you were, saw the light in you, and still chose to war against heaven's favorite. Now they tremble, not because you're vengeful, but because God vindicated you without you lifting a single hand. Chosen One, your silence was your shield. Your patience was your weapon. And your elevation? That's the punishment. They can't even utter your name now because it's soaked in power. Because it reminds them of what they lost when they dared to touch what heaven had sealed. You are not to be played with. You are not to be doubted again. You are remembered in heaven and now feared on earth. You see, most individuals react indignantly. You had a plan in response. On the first night, you let them set up the stage and then gave it your all. You put all that artificial love in the past. You studied all that jealousy, then turned the page and gave it back in a way so lyrical that Shakespeare would have wept. Hold on tight, because this isn't about small-time retaliation. Chess in a burning room is what this is. You accomplished more than just evade their scheme. It's your promotional trailer. You didn't flinch. Real ones don't react to turmoil. They assess it, which is why you didn't flinch. You didn't act out or cause a scene when you saw the jealousy beginning to sneak in. You hesitated. You noticed. You said nothing. You were scanning the landscape, not because you were terrified. When they feel assaulted, most individuals get agitated. You had surgery. You mentally slowed down time, examined the change in energy, and saw how each phony grin flickered slightly too late. They anticipated your panic. They anticipated a furious reaction, a boisterous altercation that they might include into their story. You were too experienced for it, however. You were aware of how power is given away by emotional responses. You also don't engage in such games. You took note of every strange movement, monitored the room's temperature, and gave them the impression that they were in charge. When the strike occurred, everything was so clean because of this. Just accuracy, no showmanship. In actuality, disorder is distracting, noisy, and messy, but only to those who have never learned to remain still in the face of turmoil. The mess was shown to you as a blueprint. All of their insults, strange vibes, and suspicious actions weren't random. It was information, and without their knowledge, you gathered it. That's the benefit of maintaining composure. For those who are too noisy to realize their own exposure, it renders you invisible. You weren't only enduring their drama. It was mapped by you. You were becoming sharper, more aware, and more threatening while they were busy attempting to shake you. And you didn't just react when it came time to answer. You gave them something that was too neat, too well managed, and too advanced for them to even identify you. When someone doesn't just confront turmoil, that's what occurs. They figure it out. And that's precisely why they didn't anticipate it. Recording the echo. Behind your back, they believed they were whispering. The echo was being recorded by you. They really thought they were being cunning. Quiet discussions, deceptive shadow, the type of intensity individuals think they can conceal beneath phony giggles and ambiguous postings. However, they failed to see that nothing is really concealed from someone who has been compelled to learn instinct. You weren't only speculating. In real time, you were seeing trends, documenting mistakes, and making connections. You allowed them to discuss, plot, and think they were getting away with it. However, you were ahead of the game, keeping receipts as prizes. Such individuals consistently undervalue those who listen more than they talk. They believe that silence equates to ignorance. The fact that you've seen this previously was something they overlooked. You've had to cope with jealousy masquerading as camaraderie. The laughter that ends after you leave the room is something you've dealt with. Therefore, you took a more intelligent approach rather than immediately addressing them. You allowed it to grow. They thought you were still learning the game, so you let them to show you their whole hand. Furthermore, it went beyond what they said. They stated it that way. How the presence of others affected their tone. How backhanded compliments were used to gain their support. You saw it everything. When the patterns were loud enough to track, you didn't have to speculate about reasons. Because of their own actions, the truth was already becoming clear. Therefore, you didn't need to expose them. You were aware that they would dig their own pit with pride and mention your name if you waited long enough. They'll never comprehend that aspect. You didn't hit me without warning. You just allowed the echo to get loud enough for other people to hear. People forget you still have ears, and sometimes a better recall than they have when they speak behind your back. Therefore, it seemed easy when you moved. But there was context for each step. There was a reason for every stillness. The whispers weren't the only thing you heard. You ensured that they left a trace behind. Energy redirection like a black hole. Their energy was greater than yours. It was like a black hole that you redirected. You didn't retaliate or lower yourself to their level when they attacked you with negativity. The jealousy, the attitude, the shade, you took it all and didn't bat an eyelid. You knew something they would never understand, not because you were weak. Not all power is loud. Knowing that you don't have to answer every shot is what gives you true power. Until the moment is ideal, sometimes the wisest course of action is to do nothing. They desired a response. They wanted you defensive, upset, and unsteady. That was their intention. They succeed by entangling others in their inner turmoil. However, you didn't contribute to it. You used all of that noise and activity to sharpen your concentration. It was gasoline that you utilized. You were quietly leveling up while they were occupied with their obsession with you. They never thought you would take inspiration from their hatred. They were taken off surprised by it. Despite their best efforts to divert your attention, they really gave you more energy. You moved wisely, not quickly. As they fought for attention, you looked around the room. Like a natural force they couldn't understand or stop, you diverted the energy. Everything they threw at you worked out for the best. Their rumors just strengthened your resolve. Their skepticism forced you to improve. Every effort to undermine you just made you more accurate. That's what energy redirection entails. The gratification of knowing they reached you is not something you offer them. They begin to question if they ever mattered at all because you entirely changed the narrative. And it was already too late when they discovered what had transpired. Intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, you were no longer even in the same place. You weren't as messy as they were. It was an improvement for you. You transformed their fire into gasoline and left untouchable while they were busy being noisy and petty, constructing an arsenal. They assumed you were ignorant because you were silent. However, you were constructing an armory rather than an alibis. You prepared while they planned. Quietness and dormancy are two different things. Because you weren't speaking out, they assumed you were in the dark. Silence was seen by them as weakness, bewilderment, and sometimes even dread. They were unaware, however, that some of the most perilous maneuvers are executed in silence. Because you were unaware of what was going on, you weren't sitting still. You did, which is why you were sitting still. You read between the lines, saw through the shadows, and knew precisely what game they were playing. However, you did something they hadn't anticipated rather than addressing them when they did. You began to amass power. You were improving your position, your strategy, and your attitude while they were secretly planning. Furthermore, you weren't going about attempting to correct narratives or making excuses to justify yourself. You were honing your craft, establishing your limits, and getting ready for an unexpected time. The problem with folks who think quiet equates to surrender is that They overlooked the fact that effective strategy is not self-evident. You didn't want to seem powerful. You were becoming stronger. You didn't have to respond to every passive-aggressive remark or defend your name in every discussion. While you were honing your next move, you were allowing them to speak, make a mistake, and reveal their cards. They were stoking something much more than retaliation with each insult, phony grin, and deceptive remark. You weren't making up reasons. You were constructing growth, evidence, and leverage. They were unaware that your quiet wasn't really quietness. It was organized. You didn't publicize the thunder, so they misjudged the storm. They failed to see the patience, the planning, and the preparation. But everything went according to plan when the time arrived. You weren't behind just because you didn't say anything. It implied that you were planning every move and anticipating the precise moment. For effect, not for attention. They made a commotion. You produced outcomes. And it was too late to change course by the time they realized you were never clueless, just calculating. You were not idle. Quietly, methodically, and completely, you were dangerous. Script rewriting. You reworked the script with them as extras after tricking them into believing they were ahead. They offered to walk into the trap since it was so beautiful. They didn't anticipate that brilliance. There was no need for you to outshine, overpower, or outyell. You gave them the attention, the opportunity, and the appearance of authority. Because you were very patient and recognized the long game, you allowed them to chat, strategize, and underestimate. You were already meticulously reworking the whole story behind the scenes, without ego, while they were certain they were in the lead. They believed they were in the lead. They were unaware that they were not the focus of the narrative. Their ego wasn't fought by you. You made use of it. Permit them to feel better. Give them the impression that they were in control. Everything was a part of the plan. Because redirection may sometimes be a more effective tactic than confrontation. You allow them to construct their delusion and even assist them in doing so. And you completely changed the narrative just when they believed they had the victory under control. That's the bit that hurt the most. It wasn't a forced defeat. They caused their own collapse. It was not a cruel trap. It was too smooth to detect, yet it was lovely and flawless. You gave the impression that it was easy. You had already studied every move before the first scene started, not because it was simple. It was not sabotage that brought them down. It was self-inflicted, guided by your knowledge and tailored by their conceit. You didn't have to demonstrate your superior intelligence. You just let the tale to develop and provided them enough leeway to choose how it should conclude. You were already in your next chapter, unafraid and ahead, when the reality finally struck. That's the art of being underappreciated until it's time to admit that you were the one who wrote it all along. Vision at high frequencies. The frequency of your vision was too high. The altitude caused them to choke. Because you operate in a bandwidth that they are unable to listen into, you anticipated it. It wasn't a dramatic moment. You weren't thinking too much. You were only seeing what others were unable to see. And before you even spoke, it made you a danger. The fact is that some individuals are so rooted in trivial matters that they are unable to understand someone who moves precisely, purposefully, and in a pattern. They are enmeshed in a cycle. Layers are what you're dealing with. On a board you had previously folded and abandoned, they attempted to play checkers. You felt more than simply jealousy. You knew where it came from. You were reading the underlying currents, while others were focusing on victories that were on the surface. They believed that sarcasm and grins might conceal their envy. However, you may trust your instincts without evidence. It simply knows. You were constantly 10 steps ahead because of this. They weren't even aware that they were transmitting while you were picking up their signals. Additionally, they were irritated when you didn't react as they had anticipated, since those who are unable to match your frequency tend to think you're being challenging. You weren't being tough, however. You had purpose. You realized they weren't wired to comprehend your actions anyhow, so you stopped explaining them. You weren't unclear. To decode you, they lacked the necessary skills. It was not conceit. Clarity was the key. You were flourishing in the same air that others were suffocating in. You chose altitude over attention, not because you're superior. You rose. You changed. You also didn't want applause. You just made a move. It was so frightening because of that. You didn't require their approval. They couldn't comprehend you anymore. The fact that you changed prevented them from retreating. They were unable to breathe where you were going, so they fell back. Vision was what you were saying. The volume was stuck. You were doing calculations. Performance was what they were after. Additionally, because the game wasn't made for their level, they couldn't even read the rules when they attempted to play you. They weren't lost. Quietly, without apology, you abandoned them. Because not everyone is suited for altitude. Furthermore, you were never intended to remain on the ground. Strategic silence. Strategic invisibility is a skill that you have perfected. Being absent is not a sign of weakness. It's camouflage on the battlefield. You weren't absent. To concentrate on the mission, you were ignoring the commotion. Because you had nothing to say, people assumed you were quiet. In actuality, you were too busy thinking about empty rooms to waste your time. You took a step back to observe the battle from the shadows, not to dodge it. That's what confused them. They were unable to identify you, track you, or predict you. You deliberately stopped being readable. You see, obvious threats are eliminated, and loud players are singled out. You discovered that early. So while everyone else was busy performing, you were perfecting. You removed yourself from pointless circles and made silence your shield. While they chased visibility, you built value. Every time they thought you vanished, you were actually repositioning, reshaping, reloading. You weren't hiding. You were evolving in private. The most dangerous people aren't the loudest in the room. They're the ones you forget to watch. You understood this. You made peace with not being seen so you could reappear when it mattered most. Sharper, stronger, and 10 steps ahead. They were watching for noise, but you moved like strategy. And when you returned, it wasn't for attention. It was for impact. That's the thing about strategic invisibility. It's not about fear. It's about control. You decide when to be seen. You decide when to speak. You decide when to strike. They thought your silence was surrender, but it was simply you choosing not to waste ammo on a target that hadn't earned the shot. You were never absent. You were just above the nonsense. Let them believe you vanished. Let them assume you faded. Because when you show up again, you don't stroll in asking for a seat. You take the entire table. Not because they remembered you, but because you never stopped working while they were watching. And that's what they'll never comprehend. Presence is power, but controlled absence is combat. Consequence over clout. They wanted clout. You wanted consequence. That's why your retaliation wasn't loud. It was legacy. They were chasing moments. You were developing something that would survive the noise. While they were busy performing, sharing, and asking for replies, you were constructing results that didn't require an audience. That is the distinction between those who want to change the room and those who wish to be noticed. They came to get your name. You came for the whole story. They believed they would become important by disparaging your name. They were unaware that they were setting the spark for something far more significant than a small-scale argument. You didn't return the clap. You were building. You had no intention of acquiring followers. You were building a structure they would never be able to enter, one brick at a time. Screenshots were what they sought. You desired outcomes, and outcomes resound more loudly than any fleeting publicity. Your work spoke for you, so you didn't have to share your perspective. Your victories spoke for you. Your development made the jealousy clear. They became sloppy as a result of your silence, making them louder. That is the result of one person concentrating on appearances while the other is establishing permanency. They were externally validated. It was rooted in yours. They were in need of praise. You need time. And it didn't blow up when your time arrived. It grew silently, forcefully, and without warning. They weren't being pulled down by your retaliation. They couldn't even understand what was happening since it was soaring so far above them. They want attention. You become a role model, and it struck more forcefully than any answer could. You just outgrew them. By being memorable, you rendered them inconsequential. You were never interested in disproving them. History would speak for you because it was so obvious, so firm, and so correct. For a day, they sought influence to feel significant. Your presence would reverberate for years because you chose consequence. That isn't retaliation. Evolution is that. Legacy is that. Redirecting their karma. You failed to return the clap. You used GPS accuracy to redirect their karma. They desired a response. You produced a result for them. Drama, a breakdown, and a trivial argument that they could screen film and turn into victimization were what they were anticipating. But none of it was given to them by you. You noticed the trap, therefore you didn't fall for it. They wanted to cause trouble, so you would seem to be the issue, but you handled it in a different way. Their energy was allowed to collapse in on itself. You diverted the flow rather than lowering yourself to their level. You didn't shout. You failed to publish. You refrained from ranting. Simply put, your movements were sharper, colder, and wiser. They came to get your attention. You gave them tact and stillness. And there was weight to that stillness. It caused them trouble. They believed you were not paying attention to them. You weren't. You were keeping an eye on everything and refusing to react in ways they could control or foresee. Life does the hard work for you. You were aware that every act of retaliation on their part was a seed sown for their demise rather than yours. You didn't need retribution. You allowed their actions to come back to haunt them in a self-wrapped box. Karma arrived to their door with their own malicious purpose after you established a location. That's the problem. They were trying to get attention. You were manipulating results. You gained momentum from their small-scale strikes. You turned every slight into a compliment. You were making adjustments while others were busy creating noise. You were winning by the time they saw you weren't applauding back. They had nothing else to say and had to watch you shine. It wasn't simply the flex that made you successful. It was the result. Because they were too preoccupied with the present and you were preparing for the fallout, they failed to anticipate the reaction. That is the strength of an action. You allow karma to be accurate and on time. They want conflict. You provided a mirror for them. And what's more desirable than achieving parity? Silently, fully, and without a desire for applause, just unquestionable results, making them unimportant. Examining intentions. They observed your movements. You researched their motives. You can see skill. Motivation lurks in the shadows. The latter you hunted. They mimicked your words, your manner, and your rhythm, watching everything you did as if it were a blueprint, believing that by copying the outside, they would somehow be able to catch the essence. However, they were unaware that you weren't using tricks or fads. You had a purpose when you moved. And although they were fixated on your actions, you were intent on figuring out why they were initially paying so close attention. Understanding the motivations behind someone's smile, praises, or unexpected assistance is the true challenge. Because jealousy usually enters in a nice manner rather than loudly. You were aware of it. The person who was applauding did not deceive you. The person who halted before them caught your attention. You were deciphering their motivation, their energy, and their urge to stay on top of things while they were studying your approach. It was not praise. It was a measurement. They lacked inspiration. There was a danger to them. You didn't panic, however. They weren't pushed out by you. It gave them the impression that they had access. You allowed them to stay, watch, and gather. And you were observing their pattern, their inconsistencies, and the times when their words didn't match their intensity, while they were occupied with following your every move. You weren't trying to win their admiration. You were examining their approach. And because talent is easily imitated, it was game over once you saw through it. But until you know where to look, purpose is invisible. You were also taught to look beyond the obvious. The fact that individuals were observing your movements did not scare you. You were researching what first drew them in. Was it rivalry, curiosity, or insecurity? All of it was clocked by you. Therefore, You didn't just block them when it was time to move. You were superior to them. They were following you, but you had already blazed the trail behind you and sketched out their purpose. Checklists were being played. Souls were being read by you. It isn't paranoid. That's accuracy. They didn't see your next move because of this. Because you were watching their hearts while they were watching your hands. The self-discipline weapon. With self-discipline, a weapon they never learned, you outplayed them. The sound of envy is loud. Silence is the hallmark of mastery. One breaks apart, while the other endures. They acted on instinct. You made a deliberate move. They would never be able to bridge that divide. You practiced something they couldn't mimic, control, while they allowed their ego and emotions drive their words. It was not necessary for you to respond to anything that was said about you. It was not necessary for you to protect yourself in every room. They didn't understand what you did. Power doesn't freak out. They want to be heard, to be seen, and to be correct. Each time, they let themselves be seen. Untidy drama, loud insults, and careless plays. That wasn't a plan. That was microphone insecurity. You didn't feed it, however. The loudness wasn't matched by you. Even when you had every motive to shoot back, you schooled yourself to overcome it. It's not a sign of weakness. That's patience fit for a battle. You were unpredictable because of your self-control. They thought you would react the same way they would, emotionally and explosively, but you remained grounded, which made you dangerous. Because you were so busy constructing things they couldn't take apart, you didn't need to clap back. Your constancy created the noise for you, so you didn't have to declare every action. They thought you were being kind. They had such a limited understanding of power. You couldn't hit, therefore you weren't holding back. It wasn't necessary for you to hold back. You came not to establish a point. You became the focal point. And without any showmanship, you succeeded. You were learning the things that really count, like timing, attention, and endurance, while their jealousy tore at them from the inside out. You developed in quiet, created in silence, and carried out in silence. And they were already behind when they saw they couldn't shake you. Under strain, envy breaks out. Pressure is mastery. They will burn out as a result, and you will continue to appear. You are anchored, not because you are louder. Self-control doesn't just outstrip disorder. Every time, it outlasts it. Driven by premonition. Their motivation was resentment. You were driven by foresight. You weren't suspicious. You were ready. They fell into your foresight because of this. You weren't responding to what was going on. They assumed you were just being careful, maybe even too sensitive. You could feel what was about to happen. You maintained your composure, while others allowed their resentment to drive them to act recklessly. You were not guessing. Your intuition detected changes before everyone else did. So you knew, not because you heard a rumor. To get ready, you didn't need evidence. Even before the catastrophe started, you could see the fissures in their vitality. They were careless out of resentment. You were surgical because to premonition. They tried to harm you from a position of their own hurt after moving on from setbacks. However, you were already ahead of the game, not because you were afraid, but rather because your instincts are always right. Long before their comments became icy, you could feel their jealousy seeping in. You could feel the change in their tone, the strained laughter, the mounting stress they believed they were trying to conceal. You didn't panic, however. You had a plan. You moved precisely, while others acted out of passion, and they struck without planning. You remained still while studying. That's what changed everything. You didn't fall for the trick. You saw them descend into just what you had anticipated. It's not luck. Vision is that. There is nothing mysterious about premonition. The ability to recognize patterns is a result of survival. They don't understand how much you've had to endure. So you weren't taken aback when the time arrived. You weren't surprised. You were prepared. You were already aware of their destination, their attempts, and their range. Because resentment-driven individuals are predictable. Their script is written by their hate. You read it as if it were a map. You didn't strike back. They weren't warned by you. You allowed them to fall directly into your silent foreknowledge. Because you don't move emotionally when you're made of knowledge rather than scars. When the moment is right, you move. They lost the game they believed they were playing alone because of this. You were propelled by instinct, while others were driven by resentment. Instinct is always right. They vowed that the storm would never arrive. You didn't need retribution. You turned into the storm they said would never materialize. The energy was not returned by you. You took it in and moved on from them. They anticipated that you would snap under the strain, snap, or become resentful like them. They believed that their darkness, silence, and sabotage would cause you to fail. However, you performed the exact opposite of what they wanted. You developed. You did not imitate their actions. You broke them down. You subtly, effectively, and deliberately transformed every insult, phony grin, and blocked door into gasoline. You were changing as they tried to divert your attention, not out of resentment, but out of need. You were aware that answering would just make you seem more like them. Furthermore, you didn't aim to be on par with them. You were creating a whole new one. In an attempt to elicit a response, they engaged in emotional games. Instead, you elevated them. A scene was what they were after. You left a legacy for them. They will never be able to get over it. You didn't have to fight back, but you didn't. You outgrew the setting in which they attempted to confine you. You allow them to maintain their vitality. You were too busy changing into something they couldn't even recognize to match their pandemonium. You didn't arrive with a grudge. You arrived transformed. You turned into all of the things they claimed you wouldn't be, and more. That's what happens when you choose growth above gaming, not to make a point. You changed the conclusion when they attempted to write you off. They are now forced to observe the exact version of you that they never thought was possible. There was no eruption in the storm. You had arrived, gathered, concentrated, and changed. They were too preoccupied with misjudging your composure, dismissing your resiliency, and underestimating the stillness to see it coming. There was no need to clap back, show off receipts, or look for proof. You just become indisputable. And the storm is that. Ascension, not annihilation. The sort that suffocates everything that is false, leaving just what is genuine. Their karma did not become you. You turned into a reminder for them. Chess at the quantum level. They believed you to be checkers. You were at the quantum level of 4D chess. They made straight-line plots. The board was bent by you. You were playing many games simultaneously in realms they couldn't even comprehend, while they proceeded in a predictable manner. One step, then the next. While you were creating a world that twisted and bent beyond their understanding, they were mired in linear thinking and preoccupied with short-term gains and trivial victories. They had a straightforward, basic, and obvious plan. Yours was intricate, multi-layered, and undetectable until it was too late. They didn't realize how deep your intellect was. They believed they could dominate the game if they could control the obvious movements. However, you weren't only responding to your surroundings. You were folding the board in your favor, making new routes, and changing the regulations. You played on an aircraft where their tactics were out of date and their pieces were useless. You worked in the endless shades of possibility, while others planned in black and white. Obstacles were seen. Opportunities were concealed, veiled, and just waiting to be taken advantage of. They attempted to use recurring patterns to trick you. Before those patterns were ever created, you broke them apart. Your multidimensional vision was superior than their linear graphs. Your stillness was taken for simplicity by them. They had no idea that every silent action was a deliberate step on a complicated map that only you had. The following move wasn't simply something you saw. You saw the subsequent move and the one that followed, creating futures they were unable to foresee at the time. They fell into traps they were unaware were placed because of this. Reacting was not your forte.